All right, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. It is now top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's training session. Today, we're going to be covering Payment Processing 101, and this particular session is on the kind of the newest aspect of our platform, which is that payment processing side. By now, I hope you've had the opportunity to attend some of our other training calls, specifically around the SpotOn core platform. Maybe you've attended one of the demos, and so perhaps you have an understanding about the marketing side of what we do. If you're new to the industry, you may not be as familiar with the payment processing side. If you are new to the industry, this is always kind of a helpful refresher. But payment processing is that credit card processing aspect of our platform. And while it can seem a bit complicated, the goal with today's training is to provide you with enough information to understand what the industry is, to have some understanding of key terms, and to give you some tips and things to look for while you're out in the field. Currently, we have all of you on a listen-only mute mode, so if you would like to ask questions, I will be opening up the line for Q&A throughout today's presentation. I also want to call attention to the chat feature within GoToMeeting. So if you notice within your GoToMeeting module, there's a little chat box, and you can enter any questions into that chat box that you may have throughout today's session, and I will address those during our Q&A. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to cover today our payment processing basics. We'll talk about the process of a transaction. We'll go into interchange, which is a key factor within our industry. We'll talk about some common interchange levels, the fixed costs of processing, and understanding the various components of pricing. We'll discuss some pricing minimums, and then we'll show you who earns what in credit card processing. We'll briefly share with you different pricing types that exist within our industry, and then I'll leave you with some tips for how to read statements when you're out in the field. Also in the appendix, we do have a glossary of key terms within the industry and also the full listing of card brand fees and assessments. And those are just kind of reference materials. So what is payment processing? In the most basic, simple terms, it is the process that allows a business owner to accept any electronic form of payment at their business, whether that's a credit card, a debit card, electronic checks, gift cards, etc., etc. Any of those electronic forms of payment to be accepted at a storefront or an online store, you need payment processing. And now to be able to accept those cards, a merchant must also have a terminal or software that captures that card data, encrypts it, and sends it off to a processor. And that's where we come into play. Now, aside from that merchant and the processor, there are actually 5 key players involved in every single transaction. Of course, it all starts with the cardholder, and that would be the customer. Every transaction has to start there with someone initiating a transaction. And then they are initiating that transaction at a business, right? And in our industry, we call the business the merchant. There's also the processor, which, as I mentioned, is us in this example. But there are many processors out there. You've got companies like Elevon, WorldPay, Heartland, Vantiv, TSYS, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. There are thousands of processors. You have, of course, some big name processors, First Data. You also have some ISOs or independent sales organizations, maybe smaller regional processors. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of processors out there. Aside from those 3, then we also have the card brands, and these are known collectively as the associations. Card brands are Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and kind of the easy way to think about card brands is you probably all are familiar with brands and logos. You know, you probably buy things that has a brand name on it. Well, all credit cards also have brand names, and if you look at any credit card, you're going to see one of those logos on there. That's why they're known as the card brands, and again, those are also known as the associations. Now, the last critical player involved with the transaction process is actually the issuing bank. If you were to look at a credit card in your wallet, you would see a card that has either one of those logos, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, or American Express. And either on the front of the card or the back of the card, you would see the name of an issuing bank. Most credit cards have the name of the issuing bank on the front. So, for example, perhaps I have a Citi Visa, so it's Citi is the name of the bank. You may also see cards that don't have the bank name on the front. I often joke about the Justin Bieber Visa card. Now, Justin Bieber is not a bank, but he partnered with a bank to offer a credit card that his fans could sign up for. But on the back of that card, in that fine print area, you would see the name of the issuing bank. Every credit card has to be issued by a bank. So they're a critical role in the transaction process. Now, every single transaction touches all those 5 individuals or entities, and every single one of those entities has some sort of financial stake in the whole process. So from the perspective of a consumer, this is usually the easiest way to start kind of laying out what a credit card transaction looks like and the whole process flow and then sort of where we're involved. This is from that perspective of a consumer, which I'm sure all of you are. You've probably all purchased something at some point in your life, and so you're probably familiar with this process. But we'll break it down now so you can see all the steps involved and who's involved at which point. So let's start at the top of this transaction flow. A cardholder goes into a business and presents their credit or debit card for payment at that business. Then that transaction information is captured by the business through their terminal or software. It's then transmitted to a payment processor. So let's say they transmit it to us. The processor then takes that information and sends that information over to the card brand based on the card number. So every card number is specific to a card type. You'll notice that Visa cards always start with 4, MasterCards always start with 5, Discover cards always start with 6. American Express is kind of its own beast and they have their own number system, but based on the card type, the payment processor can discern which card brand they need to contact for an authorization. So they send that information off to the card brand. Then the card brand gets the information and they can tell which bank actually issued that credit card. So the card brand will then send that data, that information over to the issuing bank and request approval for that transaction. At this point, the issuing bank will assess whether there's enough funds available on the card and either choose to approve or decline the transaction. So for example, let's say they approve the transaction. Once the issuing bank approves it, they send that approval code back to the card brand. They say, Visa, we're going to go ahead and approve that transaction. And then that card brand sends that approval back to the payment processor. So for example, they'd send it back to us. Then the payment processor sends the approval back to the merchant via their terminal or software. And then the merchant lets the cardholder know, great, your transaction was approved. Go ahead and you've purchased these items. Have a great day. All of that happens within split seconds. Every single time a transaction is processed, each of these steps takes place. And it may not seem like it because I know you may go into a store and you're not waiting there for minutes. You're typically waiting there for a couple of seconds while a transaction goes through. During those few seconds, this entire process happens. And that, is, in a sense, is payment processing. Now, why there's risk in our industry is payment processing. You'll notice once we got to the issuing bank and they've approved the transaction, now there's actually cash flow happening. This first side here, this right-hand side, no cash has exchanged hands. No money has moved. Simply a request has gone through. But once it hits the issuing bank and the issuing bank approves the transaction, now we actually have money flowing through the financial system. This is why for our merchants, we do require a merchant application because it is an actual, there's actual financial risk within our industry. One of the reasons there's risk is because of how credit cards are billed. Now, if you think about this transaction, this whole transaction process happened in split seconds. But as the cardholder, you're not billed every single day for every transaction you make. You're billed at the end of your billing cycle, which could be, 25 days later. So at the end of that 25-day cycle, you'll get a bill from your credit card company, your issuing bank. They'll send you that bill. Then you have a bit of a grace period by which you can make the payment on your credit card. And ideally, you pay your money back to that issuing bank. Now, we know that sometimes this doesn't happen. Sometimes cardholders are not paying money back to the issuing bank. And so in that sense, there's also risk on the issuing bank's part. They're lending out money, and there's a potential for them to not get money back. So there's some risk here on the issuing bank side. And while you may not realize it, there's also some risk on our side as a payment processor. And I'll explain what that risk is in just a moment. But we do also carry some risk, not necessarily as much as the issuing bank, but there is risk involved for us as well. I typically pause here to allow for some questions because this is the first time we actually talk about the process flow. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the lines to see if anybody has any questions about what I just shared. What questions are out there? Anything?
Hi, this is Zach Parkman from Fargo, North Dakota.
Hi, Zach. How are you?
Very good. Does this process apply to things like Apple Pay and Droid Pay?
Yes, every credit card transaction. So yeah, so in your Apple Pay wallet or your Android Pay wallet, you've loaded up your credit cards, and so that credit card information is already stored within your phone. But when you're actually using that to transact business, when you use your thumbprint, you pay for something just with your phone, it is still initiating the transaction.
Oh yeah, because your credit card's on file. Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to move forward then. So I talked about the risk within the industry. The risk is primarily with the issuing banks, but we also, as a processor, have some risks as well. Now, there are things that are put in place in our industry to cover those risks. And to cover those risks, there are certain costs that are implemented. The costs within our industry are what are known as interchange. And interchange is a critical part of our industry. At the very basic level, we want you to understand what interchange means, the limitations of interchange, and kind of what the role is in credit card processing. So interchange, as I mentioned, is the cost of processing credit cards. Now, the credit card rates, the interchange costs, are set by the associations, by Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express. It's something very important to note that interchange is the same for every single processor. Every processor has the exact same interchange costs because, again, interchange costs are set by the associations for the entire industry. So no processor has the ability to change interchange costs. They're always the same for every single processor out there. And I've been in the industry since '97. I can tell you that interchange in the 20 years that I have been here have not changed all that much. They've been fairly stagnant based on Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express's guidelines. They've kept them fairly flat. So overall, they don't change very often. And when they do, if they do, Visa and MasterCard have 2 times a year when they can change interchange. It's April and October of each year. It's what's known as spring release in April or fall release in October. Those are the 2 times a year that they can implement any sort of change. But for the most part, there really have not been very many changes to interchange costs overall. There was one minor change in 2010, and that was the Durbin Act that had to do with debit cards, which we can talk about at a later point if anybody has any questions on that. But overall, just know interchange is fixed cost. It's the cost of processing credit cards. One way I like to put it into perspective, let's say you have a restaurant and you're a business owner who owns a restaurant. Every day you have to buy certain goods. You buy your bread, you buy your meats, you buy your produce, you buy all the beverages that your patrons drink. So you buy all of these hard goods, and then you whip them together into this fantastic meal, you add a markup, and then you sell those items as an entree to your guests. Now, if you're a business owner, you're not selling your meals at cost. You're not charging them $3.42 for that meal, even though that might be the true cost of the hard goods. You are charging them whatever that cost is plus your markup because you're a business and you want to earn some profit from your work. You want to essentially cover the labor costs and any other costs associated with your business, plus, of course, then return a profit. So that's kind of in perspective. That's what interchange is for us. Interchange is our bread, it's our meat, it's our produce, it's our beverages. And like any business, we're going to take those costs and then sort of build them up, which we'll get into another slide. But interchange literally has hundreds of rates. If you would see the book that's sitting on my desk, it's about 94 pages, and on every single page there are lists and lists and lists of various interchange clearing levels, which is what they're known as. Each clearing level has a different cost associated with it. And why there are so many is each card type, each way you transact a transaction, every business type. So there are clearing levels for supermarkets versus auto rental, for example. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rates. We do not expect you to know all the rates. We do not expect you to even know half of the rates. We simply want you to understand what interchange is and understand that it is fixed and understand just kind of at the high level what interchange means for us as a processor and what it means for the merchant. Now, aside from interchange costs, there are also some fixed card brand fees, and I've listed a couple of them here. That's the Visa FAMF fee, the MasterCard NABU fee, Visa Acquirer Processing fee. There are several other fees which are all listed in the appendix. These are also fixed cost fees, and these fees go directly to the card brands, to Visa or MasterCard, etc. One thing to note, interchange actually does not go to Visa or MasterCard, Discover, or American Express. Interchange costs go directly to those issuing banks. The ones who are carrying most of the risk, they're the ones who get interchange. That's the cost that they get to collect. The card brand fees are a little bit different, and those go to the card brands. Now, you might be wondering why there are so many different interchange clearing levels. Why aren't there just, 1 or 2? Why are there hundreds of clearing levels? And there are 2 main factors that contribute to why we see so many rates or costs within interchange. The first one is risk. So a higher risk transaction is going to have a higher cost. Think about transactions that are done over the internet, transactions that have to be hand keyed in. Those have a higher risk because the card is not physically present. And so to compensate for that, you're going to see a higher interchange cost. Also, the other element that drives interchange is expense. the more expensive a card is to maintain or manage, the higher the interchange cost is going to be for that card type. A great example would be our rewards cards. Now, everybody loves rewards cards, right? You love to get free things. You love perks or cash back or airline points or whatever it is. People love their rewards cards. Now, from a consumer perspective, we love rewards cards, and it feels like we're getting something free, right? But unfortunately, rewards cards are not free. There are costs for those cards, and the people who actually end up paying for those costs are actually the merchants. And here's why. Those card types, those rewards cards, are much more expensive for the issuing bank to maintain. You think about it, standard credit cards, the only costs they have are really maybe statement cost if they're mailing out statements. Perhaps it's, a couple calls into the 800 number. Very, very low costs for a standard credit card. Now make that a rewards card, all of a sudden that issuing bank has to pay something back to their cardholder. They have to give them some credit in some sort of way. So now that card not only has costs for statements and costs for 800 number of calls, now it has the cost of whatever it is that they're providing back to that cardholder as a perk. So those cards are a bit more expensive to maintain, and the individual who actually pays the additional amount for that are those merchants. They have a higher interchange cost. Now, if you have a rewards card, you're probably feeling bad right now. You're probably feeling like you've cost some merchants some money. Don't feel so bad. One thing to note about rewards card holders, they typically are very loyal, very active card users. So rewards card holders tend to spend more, they tend to buy more because there's that idea that they're getting something back for their spending. So don't feel so bad. You're probably a very good customer. Now on this slide here, I have some common examples of various interchange levels that you may see. This is not an exhaustive list. As I mentioned, there's 94 pages, so this one is just a quick overview of some of the more common interchange levels, and I wanted to share this with you so you could kind of see the range of costs associated with different card types. If you look at the top of the house, a retail debit transaction is 0.80 and 15 cents of cost. Now, if you look down here, say you had to hand key a transaction, it's 1.80 and 10 cents. Again, that's a higher risk, so it's a higher cost. One that I really, really want to ensure that you understand is this last one here on the list. And this is what's known as EIRF. It stands for Electronic Interchange Reimbursement Fee. The reason I point out EIRF is EIRF is actually an error message. So if a merchant were ever to see this on their statement, there's something that they're not doing properly with their transactions that are causing them to downgrade and have a higher cost. This is not something that is typical business. So if a merchant sees this, then have a conversation with them about how they're processing their transactions, because EIRF is something that's actually avoidable. And if you can help them avoid higher costs by simply teaching them how to process the transaction better, then you've helped that merchant save money without even having to touch their rates. I often get the question as to what causes EIRF transactions. Why would a business owner have these types of transactions on their statements? Usually the two reasons we see an EIRF transaction are, number one, the merchant hand-keyed a transaction in and didn't list the zip code, the AVS code. So many times business owners feel like, oh, it's going to hold up my line if I have to ask for a zip code. Let me just go ahead and pop the credit card number in, and I'm just going to push this transaction through. I'll enter all zeros, or I'll just enter the zip code here at my business. Unfortunately, when that transaction authorization request goes through, that zip code now does not match the billing address on file for that credit card. And so that credit card transaction may get approved, but it's going to be considered a very risky transaction, and so it downgrades to this, the 2.3 and 10. Another reason we see EIRF is a merchant forgets to batch their equipment down, batch their terminal. And batching is when you settle at the end of the day. You essentially are sending all those transactions off to the bank for processing. The transaction approvals that a credit card transaction receives are only good for 2 days. So if a merchant fails to batch out within those 2 days, and maybe they batch out on the third day because they forgot, they went on vacation or they were gone for the weekend, they come back, they batch out their terminal, those transactions may still go through. However, that authorization code is actually no longer valid. It's an invalid authorization code. So the credit card company could choose to decline it. Most often, they actually still will approve it, but they're going to slap a much higher cost associated with that because now it's much more risky because that cardholder could dispute the transaction. So this kind of just gives you an idea of the various levels of interchange. One other one I do want to point out is CPS retail. This is the interchange cost for a standard retail transaction, 1.51 and 10 cents. If there's one rate that you can remember that one, 1.51 and 10. And the reason I say to remember that is as you're looking at statements and you see that someone is priced a certain way, interchange plus, for example, you'll want to be sure that you see this number here, 1.51 and 10 cents. I'll explain why in a moment, but it's that number. Know that. It's like knowing your ABCs, right? This is a very, very important critical number within our industry that helps you pinpoint what a merchant is actually paying. So I'll pause again to see if anybody has any questions about interchange. Any questions, you guys? No? All right, well, I'll keep going. All right, aside from interchange, I did mention that there are other fixed costs known as card brand fees, and so we have a list here on the screen of various card brand fees. Now, the card brand fees are fixed, as I mentioned, so every single processor must pay these, and these are the fees that actually go to the card brands, to Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express. I've listed some of them here on this slide, so you'll see like Visa fees, you see the assessments, the FANF fee, international acquirer fee, et cetera, et cetera. Again, you don't need to know what all of these fees are or the amounts because they are fixed. Every processor is going to be charging these to their merchants. We have to pay them to the card brands, so every processor must collect them. Now, that's an important thing to remember because if you get a statement and you see any of these fees on a statement, it's important to know that these are not junk fees. These are not fees that some processor has just chosen to add in. These are actual valid fixed costs within our industry. So if a merchant is paying them today with their current processor, they're also going to pay them with us when they process with us. Very important point to note. Something else to point out here, these numbers right here, what are known as the assessments, the 13 basis points for Visa, the 12 for MasterCard, the 10.5 for Discover. These are important numbers to know because they actually are what we help build our rates around, are these assessments right here. But just as an FYI, this slide, again, if there's one point that you could take from this, know that card brand fees are fixed. Every processor must pay these, so every processor must collect them. They are not junk fees, and a merchant paying them today will also pay them with us. So now that you understand the fixed costs, interchange and card brand fees, how does that impact what pricing we have within our industry? It's important to note that we are businesses in our industry. Every processor is a business. And so when we're pricing merchants, we want to make sure that we're covering costs, just like any business would want to do, right? So I've laid out here on the slide 2 examples of 2 different card types and what the costs are. On the left-hand side, you'll see here, these are retail transactions. So these are retail credit card transactions. These are not rewards cards. These are just your standard Visa or MasterCards. And these are the fixed costs associated with them. You'll see that these are the interchange costs right here on the first row. Then on the second row, we have those assessments that I talked about. And then in total, you'll see what the total fixed costs are. On the right-hand side, we have the retail debit transactions, the fixed costs, and the assessments, and then again, total costs. For my examples I'll talk about right now, I'm going to reference primarily just the Visa transactions because the majority of cards in the marketplace, 60 to 70% are Visa transactions. So most of the time as processors, we're going to reference Visa's costs because those are the majority of the costs that we will see. So let's look at the Visa retail transaction costs. This is a true fixed cost for one Visa transaction. Every time a Visa transaction is run at a merchant's business, the costs that the processor must pay to Visa and to the issuing bank are 1.64% and 10 cents per transaction, every single time. Now, the reason I point that out is when you're out in the field, and you may have heard this already if you've been out there prospecting, you may have a merchant who tells you, you know what, I'm only paying 1%. There is no way you can beat my rate. If a merchant tells you that, and you see here that fixed costs within our industry are 1.64% and 10 cents per transaction, do you think it's really possible that they're only paying 1%? I would venture to say no, because processors, as I mentioned, are businesses. No processor is going to charge a merchant less than fixed costs. You're not going to go into a restaurant and pay less for your meal than what the restaurant paid to buy all those ingredients, right? Businesses are businesses. They're not going to charge less than their costs. So when you come across that out in the field, and you have a merchant who says, oh, I'm only paying 1%, my recommendation in terms of how you would respond to that is, that's really quite interesting. If you're only paying 1%, that's actually less than the fixed costs of our industry. I would love to take a look at your statement and see what else is going on there, because I have a feeling that there are additional fees that are built in by your processor. So use that as your entry point. You don't need to remember that it's 1.64 and 10 cents as the true cost. If you can remember that, that's great. But even if you can't remember the number, know that if you hear anything, less than this, then know that there's something else going on, because every single processor must pay these costs to the associations, to the issuing banks. These are fixed costs. So just a helpful tip when you come across that out in the field, because I guarantee you, if you haven't had it yet, you will get that from a merchant. And it's just simply not possible that they would pay that. So in terms of how we price, now that you know fixed costs, you know what's made up of the different the different fixed costs that we have to pay, let's talk about how we then build pricing around that. Now, the rate that we charge a merchant is what's known as a discount rate. That's true within the industry. It's the term used for the rates that we charge. The reason it's known as a discount rate, I know the word discount typically has a certain connotation. Most of us think of a discount as something positive, like you go into a store and you get 10% off, you get a 10% discount, and you're really excited. In our world, the discount rate is called discount because the amount that the merchant runs through their terminal, the amount of credit card sales, they actually don't get to keep all of that at the end of the day, if you think about it, because they run $10,000 in sales this month. Well, then we take out our fees, and so the amount that they are left with is discounted down by the rate that the processor charges, hence the name discount rate. Now, when a processor is building a rate for a merchant, think about pricing for any industry. The main goal when you're pricing something is to price effectively to cover your costs, and in our industry, the costs are interchange and those assessments, those card brand fees, and then you build in your profit margin as a business, right? In our industry, that profit margin is known as DIA, and you probably can surmise why it's DIA, but I'll get to that in a moment. So let's break this down a bit. The discount rate, as I mentioned, this is the rate that's charged to the merchant for their processing, is made up of interchange costs, assessment costs, and profit margin. Helpful way to think about where everything fits into the picture. Interchange costs, I, go to the issuing banks, I. Assessments, A, go to the associations, A. And profit margin, P, goes to the processor, P. Now, as I mentioned, interchange and assessments, these two items here, these are fixed costs. There's nothing any processor can do to change these two things. So in order to change a rate, the only number that a processor can do anything about is this profit margin number right here. So keep that in mind as you're talking to your sales directors, your sales analysts. Know that we can't change these. We can't change interchange or assessments, but we can change profit margin. We can either choose to increase it or we can choose to decrease it. Now, something important to note about profit margin, I'll explain in just a moment. Again, let's look at that discount rate. The discount rate is the rate we charge the merchant. After we've charged the rate to the merchant, we've collected those fees, we have to then pay out the interchange costs to the issuing banks. We have to pay out assessments to the associations. And then what is left is that profit margin, or that DIA. Discount rate minus interchange minus assessments, D minus I minus A, DIA is profit margin. Why profit margin is so important to you as a sales executive? Well, that's where you earn your residuals. So as I mentioned, you earn residuals off of profit, and profit is not earned off of interchange or assessments because those are costs, right? Those are fixed costs. We don't make profit off of costs. We only make profit off of our profit margin. So when you're pricing somebody, it is our goal, of course, to price effectively to save money for the merchant. That is our guarantee. However, we also want to ensure that you're earning compensation for your hard work. So we will work well with your sales directors. We want to make sure that we're pricing the account effectively, but also that there's some profit in there. We want you to earn residuals. We want you to earn money on your accounts. So very, very important to note. Again, only thing that we can change in pricing is profit margin, and that is what we derive your residuals from. Now, within our industry, there are actually 3 pricing types that are common. At SpotOn, we only offer 2 of these pricing types, tiered and interchange plus, or what's known as pass-through. There's a 3rd pricing type in the industry, what's known as a fixed or blended rate. We do not offer this primarily because of the way it's positioned to the merchant can often be very misleading. There are some processors out there who still offer this pricing. Though it sounds great as a fixed rate, it actually is not. There are other fees that are built in after the fact that really can increase the rate substantially. So because it's not a very transparent way of pricing, and because we are committed to transparency for our merchants, we do not price that way. So when you work with your sales team here, the only two pricing types you will see them provide you with are either tiered or interchange plus or pass-through. So I'm going to pause again to see if anybody has any questions at this point. What questions are out there? Anybody? Does anybody have any questions about any of the content? No? All right, well, I'll keep going. So let's go back to our example of that transaction process we talked about earlier. Now that you understand interchange, you understand the card brand fees, the fixed costs of our industry, and then you understand how processors generate profit, let's look at that transaction again and see where all the money goes in a transaction. So here's our example. Let's say I use my Visa card to buy $100 worth of clothes at a merchant's. Now that merchant's processor set them up with a 2% rate and 20 cents per transaction. So that's their discount rate. And remember, the discount rate is made up of interchange, assessments, and that processor's profit margin. So if we break down that rate, the 2% and 20 cents, 1.51% and 10 cents of it is going to be just interchange costs. 13 basis points, or 0.13%, are the assessments. That's the Visa assessment. And that difference is 0.36% and 10 cents. Now this is that processor's profit margin. So I mentioned this was a $100 transaction. A $100 transaction would cost the merchant $2.20. You get that by multiplying 2% times $100. That's $2 plus 20 cents for that transaction. So the merchant's going to pay $2.20 for this transaction, but where does all that money go? Let's look at the process here. So again, cardholder initiates request for a $100 transaction. Then that terminal sends that authorization request over to the payment processor. Payment processor gets that $100 authorization request and they send it to the card brand. Then the card brand gets that authorization request for $100 and they say, okay, issuing bank, we've got this request on this Visa card for $100. Are you going to choose to approve or decline? Now the issuing bank has that request and they either choose to approve or decline. And let's say, for example, they approve it. Now here's where things start to get a little different. The issuing bank approves the $100 transaction, but they keep their share at that point. So as I mentioned, interchange goes to the issuing banks. So that interchange cost of 1.51% and 10 cents, or 1.51 times $100, which is $1.51, plus 10 cents, so $1.61. The issuing bank keeps $1.61 and sends $98.39 over to the card brand. Now the card brand sees it come through as a $100 authorization request, but they only get $98.39. The card brand then says, okay, issuing bank took their share. Now we're going to take our share. So Visa is going to take their assessments, their 0.13%, or 13 cents. So they're going to keep their 13 cents at that point. Then Visa is going to notify the processor that the transaction was approved. The $100 transaction was approved, but we're only going to give you $98.26, processor. So then the processor receives the approval, they receive the $98.26, and then here's where things also change again. Most processors, us included, will provide the merchant the full $100. Now some processors won't. Some processors will only pass on the $98.26, but here at SpotOn, we provide the entire amount up front. So that merchant is going to get the full $100. At the end of the month, when we bill the merchant, we will bill them for the $2.20. We'll collect our fees after the month has progressed. So in the end, the merchant is left with $97.80. But they don't feel that today. Today, they get their $100. Now, if you think about it, all this money was already taken out, $1.61, 13 cents. So who is out some money right now? We are, as a processor. So this is actually where we, as a processor, carry some risk because we have given the full $100 out front, and we're not going to be able to collect on that fee until the end of the month. And so where there's a couple days here, maybe even a couple weeks, where we are out some money. This is what's known as fee risk because we are, we've essentially fronted the entire amount to the merchant, and we may or may not get that all back. When we do collect the $2.20, What we're left with as our share is 46 cents. That's all we made on that $2.20 transaction. So if you think about it, I'll show you the percentages here. The bulk of the money, almost 73.2%, goes to the issuing bank, and that's pretty standard. Anywhere from 70 to 75% of the transaction costs that are collected from that merchant will go to the issuing banks. Anywhere from 5 to 7% will go to Visa, and 20 to 24% or so will go to the processor. Now again, because the processor can change their profit margin, they have the ability to control this number. So some processors may really inflate their rates and have a tremendously large profit margin, and so their share may be a little bit more, and that can entirely happen. But just to give you kind of an idea, you can see here that in credit card processing, the majority of the fees that are collected do not reside with us. They do not reside with Visa and MasterCard. They go to the issuing bank. The reason I point that out is as you're out there prospecting, you're probably going to hear some people who don't want to talk to processors because you're always charging me fees. You guys charge me too much. You're going to hear all kinds of stuff. But I want you to feel comfortable in knowing that while we are a processor and we are a business, we charge very, very fair margins. We don't overinflate rates. And the majority of the fees that we collect do not go to us. They go to the issuing banks. So something to think about with the issuing banks. They're making the bulk of the transaction processing money, right? But remember, I talked about how they bill the cardholder at the end of the month. So they're going to bill that cardholder and collect the money back. But we know this doesn't always happen. A lot of cardholders don't actually pay their full credit card bill off every month. They may pay a portion of it off. So if you think about it, the issuing bank is now collecting that interest that's accrued on that balance. So an issuing bank is making money on the processing side, and they're also making money on the actual card side. So they're making money on those credit card interest charges that are racked up. So they're kind of making a lot of money in credit cards. We as a processor aren't making a lot of money. We're making a tiny bit. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Again, I'll pause to see if anybody has any questions. What questions are out there, you guys? All right, Tim.
I have a question.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So basically, I joined in just a little bit late, but my gatherings is that, as like you said, the banks make most of the money.
Mm-hmm.
And would you say that as a whole, the merchants are up? Do they understand this process that you're going through right here?
Probably not. And that's
okay, so
kind of what you get to do as a consultant is educate them. Most merchants have no idea this happens. It is public information, and I like to say it's public and published. If you go to visausa.com or if you go to MasterCard's website, you will see all of this information laid out. You'll also see all of the interchange costs. Again, they are public. So you could go to Visa or MasterCard, pull up interchange schedules, and you could see all the costs there. But most merchants don't know. They're very busy in their days, and this is probably the last thing they want to research. So that's where you as a consultant can really help enlighten them and teach them and share with them. Most merchants have no clue about all the goings on of this, and if you can help simplify that process for them, they're usually very, very grateful for that.
Yeah, for example, I just had a conversation with a merchant that I'm very familiar with, done business with for over 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
and he come right out and said that his rate that he is paying right now is 2.5%. So then obviously I've just learned about assessment and fixed costs, so really his processor is probably pulling maybe 1%.
Maybe.
Or not even 1%.
Yep.
Okay. So, well, I'm just trying to put two and two together here. Just had a conversation before I got on the call here, and good stuff. Thank you.
Fantastic. You're welcome. And Jeremy brought up a good point, asking if most merchants know about this. Most don't. But as I referenced, you can direct any merchant to go look on Visa or MasterCard's website. We actually had a merchant who wasn't quite believing one of our sales executives when they were talking about fixed costs. They patched me into the appointment, and we walked them over to the Visa site. They actually wanted to see it for themselves and, help them get onto they were on an iPad. They got onto a browser. They went to Visa, and she pulled down the interchange schedules, and the merchant went, wow, okay. So she was, not really, I think she was still a little bit uncertain. And it happens in our industry. There's a lot of things that other processors have done that probably create a little bit of mistrust for our industry. But once she saw it, It completely opened her eyes to what was actually happening. So again, if you need to reference this, you can go to Visa or MasterCard's websites. You can pull it up. Any merchant can see it. It is public information. Any other questions, you guys?
Yeah, Zach Parkman here again.
Hey,
So
Zach.
why does Spot On pay the full $100 up front and collect at the end of the month or whenever the bill goes out, instead of just doing in this example, $98.80 to the business owner, and then they don't have to worry about it at the end of the month because it's already paid?
Yeah.
What benefit is that to us, or to Spot On and the business owner?
We do it to simplify things for the merchant. So most processors process this way. Most processors will pay the full amount up front and take fees out later. Some businesses, and a business who doesn't want that, if they want the fees taken out every day, we can certainly do that. You would simply make a note on the application that they're requesting daily discounting. Discounting is, fees taking out every day. But the reason we do it is, as a business owner, we're trying to simplify things for them. So if I run $1,000 in sales today, I don't want to have to figure out, okay, how much was taken out for fees, how much was going to go here, how much am I really left with in my bank account tomorrow. We want them to be able to feel like I ran $1,000, tomorrow morning I have $1,000 in my account. So it's a way of sort of simplifying their accounting for them, that they're getting the amount in sales today that they ran today.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And that is our default, to do the monthly billing versus daily discounting. If a merchant wants daily discounting, we can certainly do that. Just sort of a selling point. Other companies, Heartland included, charges a merchant if they want to do monthly billing. So say, the merchant says, I want all my $1,000 today. I don't want any of the fees taken out. Heartland and several other processors will add a charge to make that happen. So they'll add additional rate so that the merchant gets their full amount every single day and they're only billed once. We don't charge extra for it. It's just simply how we process by default.
So that's a very good thing for the merchant as well.
Absolutely. Any other questions, you guys?
I do have one more question. This might not be the place for it, but in that conversation I just had with the merchant, one of the first things he mentioned was that he wasn't sure if Spot On would be, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be, oh man, I'm failing big time. I'm looking for the words where the processing equipment is compatible, that's the word, with the software. Do you run into issues like that?
We do sometimes. We have a master database of all the various softwares and hardwares out here. So if you come across something like that, simply contact your sales director or our partner support team, and they can verify whether or not we're compatible with their software. And I'm not sure if this is the other part of your question you're going to be asking, but there's something in our industry known as PCI compliance. That's people for industry compliance. PCI compliance is a requirement in our industry, and it's essentially ensuring that as a processor or as a merchant, we're doing everything we can to protect data. So it's encrypting the terminals, encrypting the transactions. As a business owner, it's recognizing that you don't give out your password to everybody, et cetera, et cetera. The equipment that we send out is all PCI compliant. We do not charge a fee for PCI compliance. So I like to point out the fact that while PCI compliance is a requirement in our industry, the fee is not a requirement. It's just that many processors kind of identified that, hey, there's this new way that we can make some more money. Let's charge a fee for this. We don't charge it. We know our equipment is PCI compliant. On a quarterly basis, we will send an email to our merchants that say, hey, please verify these items, that you understand, that you're not supposed to give out your password, that you'll protect any receipts, et cetera, et cetera. If a merchant doesn't validate those, it's a very simple questionnaire. I think it's like 8 questions. If they don't validate it, we still don't charge them. We're not going to hit them with a penalty fee, but many processors will.
Gotcha. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great questions. Any other questions, you guys, before I move on? No? All right, I'll keep going. So since we were talking about some other processors, it's kind of a perfect segue. I actually have here a slide of how we compare to other processors out there. And these are probably the ones we most commonly see here at the office when you're sending in your statements for analysis and proposal. Of course, we have Square, Stripe, PayPal, all the First Data alliances, which are Clover merchants. Clover is actually owned by First Data. So if you see a business that has Clover, know that that business is processing with some sort of First Data Alliance. Bank of America, this is actually a First Data Alliance, but that's the last company I was with. I left them the Friday before I came here to Spot on Monday. So I included some additional insight about how they price on this comparison. You'll see we have some information on Heartland and how they price and their fees, Costco, and then you'll see ours at the bottom here. So you'll see our pricing compared to everybody else. So this page here, I often recommend, go to the sales portal, pull this down. This is in the document section, the sales partner materials. This is called Payment Processing 101. You can pull this page down, print it out, use this as you're out there, understand kind of what you're up against. But no, as I've talked about, we have our low cost guarantee. We are going to save our merchants money. One of the reasons we can do it that way is because we have extremely low cost of overhead. So remember we talked about, businesses have to cover their costs and then they add in their profit margin. Well, in terms of costs, we know there's the fixed cost of interchange and card brand fees, but then processors have other costs. So if you think about the big name processors, I can speak from the experience of I was at Wells for 15 years and Bank of America for 5. The overhead costs at those two companies were tremendous. Think about their marketing budgets alone, commercials, billboards, mailings, et cetera, et cetera. And then you think about all the lease spaces that they both had, thousands of leased buildings that they had to pay for every single month, hundreds of thousands of employees. And the list goes on and on and on. Overhead costs for those two companies were tremendous. And so the merchants pay a part of that. Those costs are sort of built in to what they have to cover for processing. At Spot On, one of the beauties of being a boutique firm is that we don't have all of those extra additional overhead costs. Our overhead costs are very low, and so we're also able to keep our pricing low. We have a very fair, kind of conservative profit margin. We're not here to gouge merchants. We're not here to get rich off of payment processing. We actually see this as sort of just an add-on to our platform. So again, keep this page near you when you're going to go out prospecting. So at least that way you have some good information and insights as you're having conversations with your merchants. When you come up against one of these statements, you'll at least have some additional information so that you can speak to that. One other slide here I have is some additional information about other fees that you may see other processors bill. And I've referenced a couple of these already. We talked about like the fee for monthly billing for daily discounting and the fact that we don't charge for that, that it's free. I also talked about non-compliance fees or PCI fees. As I mentioned, while PCI is a requirement, the fee to charge for it is not, and so we don't do it. But there are other things here that you may see on other statements from other processors, a whole litany of things like batch fees, statement fees, monthly fees, maintenance fees, etc. Just know that we don't charge them. Also, you might see things on statements where a merchant is paying 2 transaction fees. They're each titled something different, but they're both essentially transaction fees. You might see one called an authorization fee and a capture fee, or an IP fee, or a Watts fee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all transaction fees. They're all just different names for a transaction fee. So many processors will have 2. We just have the 1. On the first line here, I'll reference something I mentioned earlier. So you might find a statement from a merchant that's priced what's known as interchange plus or pass-through. And it might look like they're paying that type of pricing. But if you remember that number, the 1.51 and 10 cents that I mentioned, if you remember that number, and if you look at their interchange plus statement and you don't see that number on there, most likely what's happening is that merchant is now adding on profit margin. So they're faking the interchange numbers. Most processors realize that most merchants have no idea what the true interchange costs are. They don't know that interchange cost for a retail transaction is 1.51 and a dime. So on the statement, they might list to a merchant that interchange cost for a retail transaction was 1.61 and a dime. So from a merchant's perspective, it looks right. They don't know. But if you know what interchange is, you'll realize that, hey, wait a minute, the processor padded that number. They built something into it. That's not interchange. Interchange is fixed, and it's always going to be 1.51 on a dime for a retail transaction. So the reason I point these things out is when you get a statement and you see these things, it's a great way to enter into conversation with your merchant about what they're seeing on their statement. I noticed you have a lot of these additional fees on here. I'd really love to take a look at your statement and provide you with an analysis, because based on what I'm seeing already, I know that we can do better for you. So just kind of helpful things to understand about the statements. The last page here are what I like to call reviewing statements tips. And this is also one of those pages that I would recommend you print out, you review before you go out prospecting, because again, this gives you some really good insights and questions to ask while you're out there. So the first tip that I give about statements is to make sure you read all those little paragraphs in the statements. It's really easy, and most merchants do this, and most salespeople do this, where they look at just the numbers on a statement. But you'd be surprised at the things you can learn by reading those actual messages on the statement. We've seen things like, beginning next month, we're going to begin charging you $49.99 monthly fee, or in October, we're going to be increasing your rate by 20 basis points. You name it, there's all kinds of different things listed. So take the time to actually read those statement messages, because oftentimes there are things that can help you sell against them, right? If you see those things, you can mention to the merchant, hey, Mr. Merchant, I noticed on here that your processor is going to begin charging you for this fee next month. Why don't we have a conversation so we can see what we can do about getting you out of that, moving you over to processing with us so that you're not hit with that fee. So it just gives you some additional insight, another way of talking to the merchant rather than just the what's your rate conversation. Look on the statement for any downgrades. That lovely term that I call ERF, again, remember that's an error message. So if you see that on there, something is happening with their transactions that simply through education, you could probably help them avoid. So if you see things like ERF, again, Mr. Merchant, I noticed that you have some ERF transactions on here. I'm interested to see how you're running your transactions. Are you batching your terminal every day? What do you do when you get a demagnetized card? I'm asking these questions because I noticed that, with these ERF transactions, those are actually things that we can fix simply by how you process. So let's figure out what's going on here. Look for things like monthly service fees, transaction fees. Why we look for those, of course, we don't have any monthly service or statement fees. Transaction fees, look for those, because if there are two, then like I mentioned, we only charge the one. Look for when their fees are taken out. Are they being taken out every day, the daily discounting that we talked about, or once a month? Most merchants prefer the monthly billing versus daily discounting, just because it's easier for them to understand their batches and their deposits. Speaking of batches and deposits, is there a delay between the batch, so when that terminal was settled, and the deposit date, so the day that the money hit their bank account? We have next day funding here. So if a merchant batches out their terminal by 10:30 Eastern, that money will be in their account the next day. Some processors don't have that type of funding. Bank to bank, so Wells Fargo to Wells Fargo, Bank of America to Bank of America. Now they will do next day funding, but many other processors will do like 3-day funding, or that other little company with a little geometric shape as a logo. They can be anywhere from 3 business days up to 21 business days for funding. Now imagine you were a small business owner and it took you 21 days to get your money. You think you'd be really happy? You think that would help you run your business? Probably not. So look for things like that. The last 3 items here are simply things to help you understand the size of the business, that when you're talking to your to your sales analyst, you can provide them with this information. But look for the total bank card volume, that's Visa, MasterCard, and Discover. Look for the bank card transactions, how many they had, and then try to identify what pricing type you think it is. Is this tiered? Is this pass-through or interchange plus? Is this fixed rate, et cetera, et cetera? So again, super helpful page to print out, to review before you go out there prospecting, so that you can identify things quickly as you get those statements, and then begin to have a different type of conversation and not just the rate conversation. The last several pages are the appendix, and as I mentioned, these are the glossary of terms, key terms within our industry. Most of these terms I referenced throughout today's training, so if you have a question about what a term was, I've got all the glossary here. And then the last several pages are those various card brand fees that I mentioned, and you can see there are quite a few. Again, keep in mind that these are fixed costs. These are not things that we can change, so every processor must pay them, but there are quite a few of them. So that is actually the end of today's formal presentation. I'm going to go ahead and open the lines to see if there are any other questions again. And I did get a couple questions here in the queue, so I'm going to go ahead and read those. Let's see, end of year wrong TIN messages. Yes, that's a good one. So this is the end of the year. Great point. So at the end of the year, the statement messages on those statements may say something like, the TIN we have on file, the tax ID number we have on file for you is invalid, or we need to validate it. Please send this information over. If a merchant doesn't read that, they will get hit with a penalty from their processor. So good time to, engage them in a conversation and follow up with them and get them moved over to us as a processor. Do we charge for next day funding? No, we do not. We do not have a fee, though I know Heartland has a fee. A couple other processors have fees for next day funding. So if they want their money tomorrow, they will charge them additional rate for that. What other questions do you guys have? Cutoff time for next day funding. That's 10:30 Eastern, 7:30 Pacific. Anything else, you guys?
So on the fixed rate, you're saying in your presentation here that there are companies who actually pad that.
Yes. We saw one the other day. Yeah, we saw one the other day. The analyst ran over and said, look at this statement. And we looked at CPS retail. CPS retail, as we know, should be 1.51 and a dime for interchange costs, but they had it listed at 2.05, I think it was, and 15 cents. And so they added in anywhere from 30 to 50 basis points on every interchange level. Merchant had no idea because it looked like an interchange plus statement because they saw these different card categories, so it looked like interchange plus, and they didn't know the numbers of interchange. They didn't know the true interchange costs, and so it looked right to them. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and our analyst caught it right away. She was kind of appalled by what she saw, but yeah, unfortunately it happens, and we're seeing a bit more of it. We probably would see one every couple weeks, but in the last month or so, we've seen 2 to 3 a week like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And another question on depositing. Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays will deposit on Monday. Saturdays and Sundays will deposit on Monday. Fridays batches will deposit on Saturday morning. Any other questions, you guys? All right, if there are no other questions, I will point out the fact that this training deck is on the sales portal. Again, it's on the Documents tab. If you scroll partway down, you're going to see a section that says Sales Partner Materials. This deck is called Payment Processing 101, so you can pull that down, print it out, review it at any point in time. We also have this training call every week, so if you feel you want to sit on another session, please feel free to join on for next week's training. If you have any questions after this call that you would like to address, please feel free to reach out to your sales director or your sales analyst, or you can send me a question directly. I'm Ishim at SpotOn.com. That's IXIIM at SpotOn.com. With that, I'll let everybody get back to their Friday. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks.
You too. Thank you.
You're welcome.